Hello guys, this is Dante, and in this lesson we'll be learning the basics of REDSHIFT for 3ds Max. REDSHIFT is a production GPU renderer that is available for several 3D software such as 3ds Max, Maya, Houdini, Softimage, and Katana. In today's lesson we'll be learning the basic workflow, how to set up your 3ds Max scene for REDSHIFT, some of the common tools and settings, how to apply some materials and add lights, and we'll also be taking a brief look at samples and how to adjust them to get cleaner results in your renders. So let's jump in and get started. In my scene, I have a simple shader ball and a backdrop, and the first thing we want to do is set REDSHIFT as our render engine. To do that, we open the render setup window by clicking on the toolbar icon and making sure we have the target production rendering mode set to REDSHIFT. We get presented with all of REDSHIFT's render options, but for now I just want to change the resolution of my output image. So in the common tab, in the output size section, I can either enter the resolution I want or I can choose from one of the presets provided. I'll just go to HDTV and set it to a 1280 by 720p resolution. So now we can click on the render button, and as we can see, we get a render of our image. It's not much now, but we will work on it later. This is REDSHIFT render view, REDSHIFT frame buffer, and it has some useful tools which we'll look at as we move along. But for now I want to mention the first three buttons. The first button is the production render button, which simply renders the image. It's similar to clicking on the button in the render setup window, and what it does is it renders your final image with all the settings you have in your render options and in your materials and lights. The second button is the start stop IPR button. What it does is it toggles IPR mode. IPR is a real-time preview mode where you can preview your scene as you work on it. This is useful when you want to work on materials and troubleshoot your lights and generally see how your materials and lights look in your final scene. Now that we have IPR mode up and running, it's a good time to add some lights and materials. First thing we will do is add some lights. I will add a simple 3-point lighting setup. So to add lights, REDSHIFT ships with its own lights, and while 3ds Max's lights can in some cases work in the scene, they will provide unpredictable results, and they are not optimized for use with REDSHIFT. And some problems you will find with the lights is like area lights may not display as area lights and may display as points. So you want to always use REDSHIFT lights. To access REDSHIFT lights, just go to the command panel. In the create tab, the first tab, in the light bulb icon, go down to the drop down menu and select REDSHIFT, and you will see all of REDSHIFT's lights available. What I want to create is a physical light, so I'll go to the top view, and as you can see, the render view changes to the top view or whichever view I have selected active. Sometimes this is not a behavior you want, so if you want to disable that behavior, you want to lock your scene to a particular viewport. So I will select my perspective viewport and click on the padlock icon in the REDSHIFT render view. What that does is locks the render view to this viewport, and now I can select my top viewport and work on it without affecting the render view. So I'll just create a physical light, drag it onto the scene, and as you will see, the scene goes black. This is because REDSHIFT by default lights the scene with an ambient light, but once you add new lights, it turns it off and uses the lights in the scene. So let's move this light into position. I'll go to the front view and just move it up, and as you can see, it's a bit bright, so I want to turn down the intensity of the light. To do that, just select the light. In the command panel, in the modify tab, you will get all of your light properties. What I want to do is turn down the intensity. There's two ways to do that. I can either turn down the exposure, or I can turn down the intensity. So I will use the intensity and set it to a lower value like 15. And I want to duplicate this light to create a 3-point light setup. So I'll just shift drag it to create a copy. Make sure I have copy selected. Rotate it. And create another copy. And rotate it. And maybe move it up a bit. Next thing I want to do is adjust the color of these two new lights. To do that, just select the light, and in the properties you can select the color from the color button. It brings up a color picker, so you can select your colors here. Another way to change the color is to switch the mode to temperature, and you can adjust the temperature of the light to change the color. So like higher values will give it a cooler color, and lower values will give it a warmer color. I will want to give this light a cooler color, so I will turn it up to around 14,000, and I'll select the other one and turn it down, switch to temperature and turn it down to around 3,000. And maybe I would like to move the top light a bit to the front to get rid of the shadow that's appearing in the front of the shader ball. And that looks good enough for now. Now that we have our light set up, we can set up some materials. As with lights, REDSHIFT also comes with its own built-in materials. So to access those, open the material editor, right click, go to materials, REDSHIFT renderer, and you will find a list of REDSHIFT materials. Most of them are useful in special cases, but the material you'll be using the most for most shaders such as metals, glass, plastic, wood is the REDSHIFT material. You will find that there is an REDSHIFT architectural material, and you might be tempted to use it, especially if you're working on an ArcViz scene, but this material is deprecated and is left in for legacy reasons. So the REDSHIFT material has all the features of the old REDSHIFT architectural material and is more efficient. So you will always want to use REDSHIFT material for your common materials. So let me click on that, and I want to create another copy of that. Let me just delete this standard material I had in here. I want to create a copy of this material since I want a separate material for the backdrop and the shader ball. So I'll just shift drag on it to create a copy. And to access the options of the material, just double click it, and on the right panel you will get all the properties of the material. So in the first material, I just want to change it to a dark color. Before I do that, let me just apply it into the scene. So I'll select the backdrop, right click on the material, assign material to selection, or I can just drag on this output node onto the object I want, and I'll give it a darker color. So I'll just change the diffuse color, which is the base or albedo color, to a dark gray. And as you can see, we have some reflections on the background. I would like to get rid of those simply by going to the reflection area and turning it to 0, turning the weight to 0. That essentially gets rid of the reflections. And I want to apply the second material we have to the shader ball. I'll select everything, Control A, and deselect the backdrop and apply this. Now that we have the material set up, let's take a quick look at some of the commonly used material properties. We won't be going in depth as that will be covered in a separate tutorial, but for this tutorial we'll cover some of the basic parameters. And to do that, I'll create some different materials from scratch. I'll create a metal material, a plastic or rubber material, a glass material, and a textured wooden floor. And to do that, I have duplicated the base material several times. Let me just do that again. Create a REDSHIFT material and make a few duplicates for each of the materials we'll be creating. So the first material I'll create is the plastic, as it's the easiest. So I'll assign that to the selection, and let's open our render view. To open your render view, if you have it minimized or closed, you can go to the render setup, and in the output tab you can click on show render view. It should bring up your render view. And let's start IPR mode, and let me adjust the base color. When you first open the material properties, the first section you'll see we have some presets of some commonly used materials. These are good for blocking out your scene, or even just taking a look at to figure out how some materials are put together. But for the sake of this tutorial, we'll just create each of the materials from scratch. So for the plastic material, I'll change the base color. I'll give it a red color, and I'll turn down the reflections a bit as they are a bit too glossy. So for that I'll go to the reflection section and turn up the roughness 2.2. So the roughness, the roughness dictates how glossy or blurry the surface is. A value of 0 giving you a perfectly polished surface, and a value of 1 gives you a nearly diffuse surface. So if we go gradually down, you will see the roughness changing. You can see the specular highlight getting blurrier or getting sharper as we go closer to 0. So I'll give it a value of like 0.2. That looks okay. So we can jump on to the next material, which is the metal material. So I'll just double click on the next material, and I'll apply it to the main top sphere. And as you can see, we have our default material. To create a metal material, you can just select it from the presets, but I'll show you how to create it using some of the settings involved. A common way in most render engines to create a metal material is to turn the diffuse black and turn up the IOR to a high value, and you would essentially get a highly reflective metal material. But in this tutorial I will just let's go back to a basic plastic. We have different ways of creating metals. The most commonly used way is to change the Fresnel to color and metal edge tint, and turn down the diffuse to black. And now we can turn up the reflectivity to the color of the metal. Say we want white, and the edge tint would be the color of the reflectivity as it goes around the edges. That's a phenomena that occurs in some metals. So you would want to use that to put that into account. And as you can see, we don't have a lot of reflections in our scene, so it doesn't really look pleasing. Now is a good point to create some HDRI lighting for our scene. To do that, we'll just create a light as we did earlier. So go to the command panel, the create tab, and on the light icon we will create a redshift dome light. So just click on it and click on the scene, and as you can see we have a white reflection on the metal, and this is because by default redshift just applies a white dome light. So to plug in our HDRI, I will just click on the general section in the bitmap tab and select my HDRI and open it, click OK, and as you can see we get some nice reflections in our metal. I want to adjust some of the roughness of our metal. I don't want it that glossy either, so let's give it a roughness value of 0.2, and let's turn down the reflectivity a bit. Let's maybe give it a golden color or a copper color. that looks nice. Now that we have our metal, I think we can move on and create our glass shader. I will apply that to the base of the shader ball. So let me select the base. Let me select the base and apply the third material. And to create a glass shader, just set the diffuse to black. And let's go down to the refraction and transmission. And I'll turn the weight up. And as you can see already, we have a glass looking shader, but it's too clear, so we don't have any shadows on it. So I will turn the weight down a bit. And I want to give it a tint. So to tint the glass, you would go to the transmitters. What confuses a lot of people is they try to tint the glass by selecting the color tab. While it will apply it will give you a similar result, this is not exactly physically accurate. So you want to set this always to white and change the tint in the transmittance. So just give it maybe a blue tint. And if you want to change the intensity of the tint to make it denser or more subtle, we can change the absorption scale. So I'll change this to 0.2. And we can also adjust subsurface scattering. If we turn up subsurface scattering, we get a more plastic looking effect. And the higher we turn it up, the more plasticky it looks, but I'll leave it at a clear glass and give it some roughness. So we do have a roughness control for the refraction, but it's linked to the reflection roughness. I will turn up the reflection roughness to change both the reflection and the refraction roughness. And we get some kind of translucent looking effect. And as you can see, the glass part is taking quite a bit longer to clean up than the other parts. This is because REDSHIFT uses samples to clean up the image, and generally the more roughness you have in a surface, the more samples are needed to clean up the image. This will become significant in a few minutes when we start looking at how to clean up our images, but for now keep that in mind. Now that we have our material set up, let me just change these transmitters to a different color. I don't like that blue color. Let's just give it a white. A gray color. Okay, now let's create the floor material. So for this, I'll just apply the third material to the backdrop. To plug in our textures, if I double click on the material in the diffuse section, we can see we can either have the color or on the right we have a box. If we click on this box, it allows us to use a map to drive the color. So we can click there, click on bitmap and select our maps. Another way to add that would be to just drag out from the diffuse color input node and select a map from the options available. I'll go to general, bitmap, and select my wood color, base color. And as you can see, we have our wood color in the backdrop, but it's a bit too big. We would want to tile it to make it more to scale. So let's tile it, say 10 times in U and V direction. Now we get a nicer tiling of the texture. I also want to apply a bump map, which I have. So to apply a bump map in REDSHIFT, you want to plug it through a REDSHIFT bump node, which offers you some controls to the bump map. So you would go to Maps, REDSHIFT Renderer, and select REDSHIFT bump map, and plug it into the bump map. And in the texture input, just add your bump bitmap. Let's not forget to scale this one as well. To tile it, I think I want to change the scale of the bump. It looks a bit too extreme. To change the scale, just click on the REDSHIFT bump node and you have a height scale. Let's give it a smaller scale, like 0.2. And I would like to adjust the glossiness of the material, the roughness. I can drive it, I will just drive it using the bump map we have. So I'll just drag this out and plug it into the reflection roughness. So the map will control the roughness, with darker areas being shinier and the lighter areas being rough, a bit more rough. So something we can also do here is turn down the diffuse a bit if it's a bit too strong. And maybe, one thing I wanted to mention, in 3ds Max, when you have height maps such as this, they may fail to display correctly because 3ds Max applies a gamma correction to the images. So if you think the map is not applying as it is not displaying as it should, just open the bitmap by double clicking on the bitmap, and in the bitmap properties, click on the bitmap parameters and the bitmap, and make sure you've set it to 1.0 to set the gamma to a gamma of 1.0. This is useful for height maps or any black and white maps you're using. As you can see, I think we get a more realistic looking image. And I would like to maybe look into some more features of the material. Let's apply a coat of varnish or some polish to the wooden floor. To do that, in REDSHIFT's materials, if we scroll down, we have a section called coating. If we turn the weight up, what this essentially does is applies a clear transparent coat on top of your material, and you can change the color as with the transmittance in refraction. So maybe we can give it a deep reddish color, and in order to change the intensity, you would change the thickness of the coat. And let's make this a bit more brown and decrease the thickness. And maybe also adjust the roughness of the coat a bit. And we can also apply a bump map to the coating. So maybe what if let's try to apply the bump map that we had in the base material to the coat. So you can just drag it into the coat bump map, and we get that polished look on the metal or on the wood floor. Now that we have our material set up, we can do a production render to see how our final result will look, since for the duration of this tutorial we have been using the IPR mode. So let's turn off IPR and start our production render.